Hello and welcome. Thank you for joining me. Whose first CircleCityCon is this? One, two, four. Mine too. Yay! My name is Billy Marsh. Some of you know me as Cannibal on Twitter. The handle sounds kind of scary, but for those of you that don't know me, but I got the name when I was a kid from taking things apart, repurposing them, cannibalizing stuff. So if I invite you over for dinner, there's nothing to panic about. The worst I'll subject you to is my terrible humor. I spent 10 years in the medical industry. Part of what I did was standing up and leading the device security team for a large medical vendor, and performed incident response when hospitals first started getting hit with ransomware. Now I work at a security company called the Phobos Group. It's a security services company that does security posture analysis. They do phishing training and various other security-related services. However, we specialize in adversary simulation. For that, companies hire us for several weeks to simulate how and what a persistent adversary would do to them, and then show them how to close those gaps. This is the founder of Phobos Group, and he gave the keynote presentation yesterday. I really believe in what this company stands for, because they take a strong security-first approach to all their interactions. I also recently contributed to the PowerShell Empire open source project. I'm not a dev by any means, but we needed persistence on laptops. When someone closes the lid, your shell goes away. I made a crude version of the tool that we needed, and then refined it until it worked the way we wanted it to. Hopefully this inspires someone to try their hand at making modules or doing something new and just giving it a shot. Find something you need and make it. My post-exploit module is now live in the main branch of Empire, so if I can do it, you can do it. And the last one's pretty self-explanatory. The original purpose of my talk was to bring awareness to some of the major issues plaguing the medical industry, but WannaCry beat me to that punch. However, it painted a much better picture for the public than I ever could. I had to change my talk quite a bit from what could happen to what did happen. Let's take a look at how WannaCry did what it did. Malware Unicorn made this image. She put a lot of work into breaking down this ransomware. WannaCry would encrypt the hard drive and hold it hostage, forcing the owner to either pay the ransom or restore from backups. Please don't ever pay the ransom. Personally, I feel like this was generally unsophisticated software. As most of you know, some ransomware or malware will look for multiple vulnerabilities and also exfiltrate information on disk or listen and send live information to a predetermined location. WannaCry basically cashed in on a recently leaked NSA exploit, and once a machine was infected, it was designed to worm its way to other vulnerable hosts. The only reason it was so prolific is that a lot of industries don't have their patching together. The worm relied on a vulnerability mitigated with a Windows patch 2 months prior to the WannaCry debut. And the patch was even released for XP and Windows 2003, which have been end of life for a while. This ransomware caught a lot of industries with their pants down. But as terrible as this was, hopefully this has grabbed the attention of the right people. This major event has told us some pretty critical things. There is a lot of risk that is not being addressed. Regulatory compliance is not a good baseline for computer security, and HIPAA is not enough to protect patient safety or patient data. Let's get a little bit of foundation before we start slinging acronyms around. PHI or PHI or protected health information is information that can be connected by one of 18 identifiers. Yay, wall of text. Sorry. This consists of mental or physical health information or the billing related to information in any medium, be it electronic, written, verbal, fax, carrier pigeon, doesn't matter. The 18 identifiers are pretty, IP addresses are even in there. URLs, they kind of put some forethought into this. But it does exclude some things. One example is the unique non-permanent ID given to a patient for use within hospital management systems. Unfortunately, this is typically a customizable field. And using the patient's social security number for this unique ID is bad, and if you do this, you should feel bad. HIPAA. Oh, HIPAA. PHI and HIPAA go hand in hand, as it's the vehicle for protecting PHI. This is a lot to cover, and could be a talk all to itself, but I wanted to establish a decent foundation, since this is important information, and not a lot of people are really aware of this outside of the medical community. Most of you have heard this term thrown around a lot. So let's get into what HIPAA actually is. So back in 1996, Congress discovered computers. Congress felt that everyone should be using these amazing computers, and the goal of HIPAA was to get administrative information into computers and away from paper. Thus, the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act was born. The people drafting this showed quite a bit of foresight and built in some security measures, but before we delve into that, let's take a look at who HIPAA is targeted at. HIPAA is mainly focused on covered entities and business associates. A covered entity consists of healthcare providers, health plans, and healthcare clearinghouses, where a business associate is like a partner. So if on behalf of a covered entity, you create, receive, maintain, or transmit PHI, you're a business associate. Keep in mind that the outsourced contractors are considered part of the business associates if they are creating or transmitting or receiving PHI. So that vendor who outsourced their support to India, that support staff is also considered a business associate. And they have to adhere to all the applicable HIPAA regulations. A lot of them don't. There are 5 main titles for HIPAA: insurance portability, fraud and abuse, and medical liability, tax-related health provisions, group health plan requirements, and revenue offsets. Title II is our main focus for this talk, and adhering to Title II is typically what is meant when you hear HIPAA compliance. This title covers fraud, abuse, medical liability reform, and administrative simplification. Title II includes the following HIPAA compliance requirements. I don't want to subject you to too much of the regulatory stuff. You can look it up if you really want to torture yourself with it. Some of it is very repetitive. Like, for example, the language for the security rule mentions protection, security, and standards twice in one sentence. So you know it's legit. We touched on just the major points within only one title, but it doesn't even begin to scratch the surface of this rabbit hole. It's important to note that a lot of HIPAA experts feel it's also confusing and pretty open to interpretation. However, this still sets the stage for how practitioners of the medicinal arts can get slapped on the wrist. HIPAA violations can be quite costly to a healthcare organization. First, the HIPAA breach notification rule within the Omnibus set of regulations requires covered entities and any affected business associate to notify patients following a data breach. In addition to the notification costs, healthcare organizations can encounter fines after HIPAA audits mandated by the HITECH Act and conducted by the Office for Civil Rights, or CR. Providers can also face criminal penalties stemming from violations of the HIPAA privacy and security rules. Additionally, it has been decided within the last 6 months that ransomware consists of a data breach, unless they can prove low probability that PHI has not been compromised. The breach notification rule is defined as anything more than 500 exposed records having to be reported. This is great for accountability. Now, if a hospital gets hit with ransomware, they can't just sweep it under the rug. And if you search for HHS Breach Report, it'll bring you to the HHS portal to see who has reported an incident. This is basically the HHS HIPAA wall of shame. And you can even export it in various file formats, which is super nice of them. In a recent conversation I had, it was mentioned that HIPAA has no fangs. It focuses more on awareness of obligations rather than enforcement. Furthermore, accountability for HIPAA rules falls mainly on complaints logged to OCR. However, to combat this, OCR is introducing an audit program. As of 2016, the second phase of OCR's HIPAA audit program is underway. This is pretty great until you realize that phase 1 started in 2011. And phase 2 isn't anywhere near actually starting the audits either. And when looking into the language for how they are determining who will be audited, it reads, OCR is identifying pools of covered entities and business associates that represent a wide range of healthcare providers, health plans, healthcare clearinghouses, and business associates. Sampling criteria for auditee selection will include size of the entity, affiliation with other healthcare organizations, the type of entity, and its relationship to individuals. Whether an organization is private, public, geographic factors present, and enforcement activity within OCR. The rough translation for this is that they have no idea. This is a very long-winded way for them to say they don't have any definitive criteria. OCR, HHR, and HIPAA are a huge machine with a lot of complex gears. And they're still trying to figure out where the clutch is. However, someone that does have their auditing together is JCAHO, or the Joint Commission of Hospitals. JCAHO is a fine organization in the sense that they will find the hell out of an organization. Mention a JCAHO audit to any hospital director, and you can see the blood drain from their face. JCAHO is a nonprofit that accredits more than 21,000 healthcare organizations and programs in the United States alone. There's also an international branch that accredits medical devices and services around the world. A majority of state governments recognize the Joint Commission, and the accreditation is a condition of licensure and the receipt for Medicaid and Medicare reimbursement. So you can see why this would be sought after. However, this does not come cheap at $46,000 on average, and accreditation needs to be renewed about every 3 years. Though JCAHO is not without its flaws and is often criticized for missing several audit points within a facility, as well as the lack of verifiable progress towards meeting the organization's stated goals. It's worth noting that no other entity certifies the Joint Commission, kind of standing on by themselves. Not wanting to let JCAHO have all the fun, in 2013, some updates were made by Health and Human Services. The HIPAA Omnibus rule was put in place by HHS to implement modifications to HIPAA in accordance with guidelines set in 2009 by the Health Information Technology for Economic and Clinical Health, or the HITECH Act. This is concerning responsibilities of businesses and business associates for covered entities. The Omnibus rule also increased penalties for HIPAA compliance violations to a maximum of $1.5 million per incident. So if HIPAA was for getting administrative information away from paper, HITECH was mainly to get clinical data away from paper, with some updates to HIPAA along the way. So who here has been to a doctor? Some of you are lying. Come on. There's a good chance your medical information's in a database. In 2014, the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act took effect. Part of that act requires the medical industry to improve quality, safety, efficiency, and reduce health disparities. That efficiency basically requires medical records to be faster and easier to access, which basically means digitizing them. Based on what we've seen with WannaCry, this doesn't exactly instill a feeling of confidence. So while HIPAA is kind of being painted in a bad light here, it's good for establishing privacy rules and shielding from blatant abuse of personal information. There is a lot of examples how HIPAA has helped privacy. But one that sticks out to me is from 1993, before HIPAA was put in place. A banker from the Midwest used his position on a county health board to cross-reference his customers with their medical data. He then called due the mortgages for anyone with cancer. I really don't have a strong enough expletive to throw at this guy. But before HIPAA, this was kind of a federal gray area. So HIPAA isn't all bad, but while we can see that the HIPAA policymakers have their heart in the right place, they still have a long way to go. By the way, congratulations, you made it through the foundation section. Yay! Yeah, it gets better from here on out. So, what could motivate someone to target an entity in the medical industry? Personally, it kind of makes me sad when a hospital is specifically targeted. It's one thing when it's the organic spread of a blind virus, but when someone puts their priorities over several people in a weakened state seeking medical attention, I just don't really understand how someone can justify that to themselves. So, let's take a look at some of the reasons why medical is a ripe candidate for attack. Medication is worth a lot of money. Some medications are also highly addictive. Social engineering your way into a hospital is surprisingly easy, and a large heist a la Firefly is rare, but more commonly theft occurs in small amounts by rogue staff or repeat residents. The thieves are going to try and sell their ill-gotten goods or consume them for themselves. There are also a lot of valuable little items and equipment in a medical facility. Syringes and electronic tracking equipment, which has to be small by its nature. Hospitals have a lot of the same poorly secured equipment. Let's say you have 50 of these in a facility on average. You then multiply this out times the number of hospitals with that equipment, usually in the thousands. It's a pretty decent botnet. There isn't really any network monitoring or log analysis at a lot of these hospitals, so it's not like they would find out anytime soon anyway. As we have seen in recent news, some drug companies are without scruple in the furtherance of their own ambitions. It would be trivial for a pharmaceutical company to hire someone to change medical records to reflect how their drug's doing in the field. It would not be difficult to hide evidence of a major problem or make a competing pharmaceutical company seem like they have a huge issue on their hands. On a darker note, a patient could be affected by an overdose, either changing their dose for a medication they will be administered, adding a conflicting drug, or hacking their infusion pump and just dumping the bag. A person of interest could also be readily targeted if it is known which hospital they'll be staying at. Ventilators are another easy target for this purpose. Furthermore, the attacker can try to make someone unidentifiable by deleting or modifying medical records, either someone else or themselves. Uncommon, but the threat is there. This is kind of touching on a previous note. An attacker could falsify medical records to win a malpractice or lawsuit. Physicians win 80 to 90% of the jury trials with weak evidence of medical negligence, and approximately 70% of the borderline cases. It would be in a doctor's best interest to falsify these records if they know they have a malpractice suit coming up, which might cause the doctor to lose his license or his livelihood. Intellectual property theft is a major concern, especially among small businesses in the medical field. A lot of research and development goes into these devices or drugs. Having that research stolen and then a competing product introduced to the market can devastate a small business, as the users of that stolen information don't have to worry about recuperating the research and development costs. If the business was able to produce a patent for their formula or device, attackers often seek foreign markets if the business was not familiar with the Patent Recuperation Treaty. Small businesses are unfortunately the ones with the most to lose from having poor security posture, and at the same time, they're the ones with the tightest budget. Ransomware. This is our flavor of the day. A hospital is arguably one of the most time-sensitive businesses. This is a prime reason ransom targets hospitals when seconds count to save lives. Presbyterian Hospital of Hollywood was the first hospital to publicly disclose it had been ransomed. In less than 24 hours, they bent and paid $17,000 to get their systems back. And in doing so, they basically opened the floodgates for attackers. Remember, don't pay the ransom. Ever. This just makes things worse for everybody else. It perpetuates ransomware being a viable means for attackers to generate money. Plus, if they know a specific hospital pays, they'll go after them again. I have personally handled 2 incidents at the same hospital from the same group using the same vulnerability they got in with the first time. This is why we drink. I've seen ransomware both as part of the regular spread and also a highly targeted attack aimed specifically at hospitals. There is so much information entrusted to the medical industry. Data that can be sold for identity theft, fraud, and spammers. That information could be used to conduct targeted phishing campaigns or people with specific symptoms that would use specific medications. You could even use it for spear phishing campaigns against specific individuals because who hasn't gone to the doctor? It's estimated that each medical record could go for as little as $2.50 a piece, but as high as $50 each if the credit card payment information is included with the record. And sometimes those are both kept in the same database. A lot of kids' information is included in these breaches as well. This sits until the person's information turns 18, when lenders are often targeting these individuals, and the fraudulent activity goes unnoticed for a long time. So that's kind of a brief look at some of the reasons people go after medical. Sometimes it's a crime of opportunity, other times it's highly targeted and planned in advance. On top of the medical industry being a treasure trove, it's a target-rich environment. The attack surface is massive. One thing they often have in common is old infrastructure. This plays a large role in a lot of the problems that we see. Some hospitals have been around for decades. Some hospital networks have also been around for decades. Old equipment with ancient firmware that hasn't been updated since installation. Windows 2000 and XP machines are plentiful, and there are even some IBM OS2 warp boxes still out in the field. Networking equipment also suffers from the same fate, where sometimes there's a hub providing the backbone for an entire hospital. Again, imagine trying to push a gig of software updates to 100 machines on a 10-base T network. This is why we drink. Old or new, a lot of these hospitals and medical networks don't employ network segmentation. This can make pivoting a walk in the park, and one of the reasons ransomware can hit a hospital so hard. Some hospitals also have poor architecture to boot, giving way to more access to the public without realizing it. If I jump on the guest Wi-Fi, I shouldn't be able to see the equipment and radiology. So this is kind of a gross oversimplification of a hospital network. If you believe the earth is flat, this is the architecture for you. Kind of also never really understood why the internet's always portrayed as a picture of clouds. But, I mean, we all know that the internet is for cats. So, let's pretend this hospital's about 20 years old, which is still pretty new. So, let me put it this way. There's a fair chance that the hospital you were born in is still around. And maybe they're still running token ring. The wireless guest network was added in as an afterthought, and everything can talk to each other. So for a theoretical situation, let's say someone in admissions decides to check their Hotmail account and clicks on every link in a spam email. Everyone knows at least one user like this. Their machine gets infected and it quickly spreads and spreads. This level of access between computers is terrible for any kind of damage control. The amount of trust which is given between vendors, hospital staff, and guests is staggering. Any one of these can introduce malware to a network, and this has happened in the past, sometimes a lot. It's not uncommon for staff to run around frantically trying to unplug Ethernet cables at the first sign of a ransomware outbreak. This one really gets me. While this might not affect the computers owned by the hospital as much if it's a newer hospital, several vendors believe that in order to apply patches to their computers, the machine has to re-go through the FDA validation. This is absolutely not true. FDA pre-market review is not required prior to the implementation of an operating system patch. But for some vendors, they just still don't get this. And they just want to keep their machines static. So MS-08, 067 everywhere, or if you want to stay current, MS-17, or why not both? Let's do both. So one thing that does stack against vendors that do patch is that they need to validate the patches don't negatively affect their equipment or their software. This can take anywhere from a week to a month to test and document, but they have to do this before they push the patch out. This also doesn't take into account problems that can occur long term as a side effect of pushing the patch out. So it's kind of a hairy mess. And I get it, this can sometimes be a challenge, but it's still no excuse not to patch. The IT department is often lacking in most hospitals as well. Most small clinics and some hospitals don't even have dedicated IT. Sometimes they'll have people show up as a contractor whenever they need it. To exacerbate this issue, medical devices are becoming more complex and sophisticated. This often results in configuration errors, which result in a terrible security posture. So imagine trying to be an administrator at one of these facilities and recognizing the issues, but not being able to have the time or the resources to do anything about it. Again. There are a lot of open ports in a hospital. Firewall is more like a chain-link fence. So with many devices requiring connections for remote support or web apps or proprietary ports for different products and services, there's doctors that want remote access to internal equipment and data stores, which tend to have their own external routes. Chain-link fence is being rather generous. This might be a bit more accurate. And I stumble across some of these hospitals on Shodan too, every now and then. And in one instance for a single hospital, it had 41 open ports. That's kind of bad. It's scary. So what happens when that machine that you have in the hospital that you purchased is no longer supported because the manufacturer went out of business? A lot of vendors don't give over control of that equipment, and the hospital has no admin privileges. What do you do in that point? You mini-cats your MRI machine and then patch it hoping you didn't just break a $250,000 piece of equipment? You're kind of limited on your options. So we have vendor and medical equipment that isn't as locked down as it could be. When users start getting familiar with the equipment, they'll start to find the gaps. If you need a good QA tester, get one of your users addicted to Facebook games and watch them try to figure out a way around the user safeguards. Humans are incredibly resourceful. And when they put their minds to it, an unassuming user can surprise you with their ingenuity, especially after they get familiar with a system or a process. The medical industry also has a lot of embedded devices. A lot of embedded devices. From pacemakers and personal equipment to inventory hardware and small equipment in a clinic. And we're starting to see ransomware for embedded devices as well. It's like the Internet of Things, but with people attached to it. So we're also in a strange point where health insurance is trying to cover less and less, so the consumer targeted equipment is encountering a race to the bottom. Because who wouldn't want an implantable life-saving device built by the lowest bidder? This is why we drink. It's good water. With the advent of new technologies and vendors wanting to be on the cutting edge to sell the latest and greatest cool new thing, so much gets pushed out the door with security as a distant afterthought. BTLE devices with weak authentication and no encryption, or NFC tracking that's easily duplicated or forged, wireless devices that are easily man-in-the-middled, and are broadcasting all sorts of sensitive information back to the manufacturer in plain text. For personal medical devices, it really pays to do your homework. Disencryption is also a big problem in a sense that there isn't enough of it. There are a lot of machines in a hospital which are difficult to move, but hard drives aren't. There's also a lot of patient information that lives on these drives, be it in text files or in databases. That database on the drive is also not encrypted. Some vendors are getting better about this, but I just want them to realize that hard drive encryption is only good if it's stolen and doesn't protect against someone getting a shell. Save folders are also all over the network. Generally desktops, and sometimes there's weak authentication, but usually there's none. Sometimes it's just stupid. Oh look, they made their password the same as the hospital gave to Wi-Fi. There's a lot of tasty documents on these machines as well. And surprisingly, a lot of vacation photos. Centralized storage is also often unauthenticated. If it is protected, it's pretty easy to brute force. There are a lot of backup files, also not password protected. Not that it would really do a whole lot of good anyway. Password documents, configs. There's a giant repository of all the information the hospital doesn't want leaked. There should be a lot more control around this. Intrusion detection systems are exceedingly rare. Backups are untested, and sometimes they don't even exist. Password reuse across multiple systems, no log monitoring, weak default credentials that are never changed or hard-coded. Hospitals are also one of the easiest environments to physically attack. If you show up in scrubs at shift change, stating that you're a temporary nurse, there will be tears of joy from everyone on that unit. Temporary nurses still need to have access to certain equipment and are given guest credentials of their own or a temporary user. While this might be heavily limited, it still grants them access to protected information. A lot of this can be attributed to one thing on the hospital side. That's budget. There's a big misconception that hospitals are rolling around in cash, but really they barely break even and they go out of business too. Updated equipment and work hours could cost in the hundreds of thousands for a medium-sized hospital, and that's just for a single vendor. It's pretty hard to justify replacing an expensive piece of equipment when it's functional and there's a lot of other critical needs at hand. There are sometimes hospitals that bring in a substantial amount of money, and they're the ones that you'll see with a better grip on security, but they're pretty far from the norm. So that is a lot of doom and gloom. Let's talk a little bit about what can be done to fix some of these problems. As a patient, there are a few things you can do to protect yourself. Ask how much information is actually required and only give what's needed. Most places require more information than is really required, and if you don't have to give your social security number, don't. Just because there's a spot on the form doesn't mean you have to fill it out. Ask a clinic if they'll be pulling your medical history or your information from another provider. Try to keep all of this on hand so it doesn't have to be retrieved. The clinic will likely store a copy on hand, and the more places your information exists, the higher the probability of it being leaked. If you have multiple clinics or providers in your area, call and interview them. Find out what they're doing to protect your data, and if they employ any kind of security services on the regular. This is kind of a cumbersome task. But by choosing where to send your business, you can eventually shape the industry. Check if your clinic is in the HHS Wall of Shame, and ask what preventative measures they've taken since the breach. If they have no idea what you're talking about, probably time to find a new clinic. The following section's aimed more at covered entities and business associates. This can be a lot for a hospital or a clinic to take on at once, but hey, start at the worst thing and take steps to improve. Stricter HIPAA security regulations. More security-focused guidelines will help hospitals walk a finer line. Hospitals under the DoD umbrella are constantly better off. They just need to forklist those requirements and just kind of dump them on HHS. I can imagine their initial reaction, but things would improve dramatically once civilian hospitals got over their initial freakout period. I know this is a really easy thing to say, but if HIPAA does a slow implementation to mirror the security rules in the DoD, this would close a lot of gaps. Hospital and clinics should also hold vendors to a higher standard and ask what security features they're putting into their new products. On top of that, also how they're going to implement those features into their current legacy equipment. Ask for a demo of all the features you're interested in from a vendor. Too many times I've seen features touted in documentation only to find out that the products, when the products are installed, that the feature doesn't actually work and might be available in a future software version. Maybe. Hospitals need to mandate a patching schedule for their machines in their control. This includes their standard PCs, any servers they run, and vendor equipment that allows the hospital to patch. For machines a hospital or clinic doesn't control, work with the vendor to make sure that the equipment stays patched. If a vendor can't provide a report of what patches have been applied to a specific machine or doesn't want to release that information to you, it might be time to find a new vendor. Additionally, taking inventory of equipment and models in the facility makes it a lot easier to check for updated firmware. While this is a large time investment up front, that return on investment is immense. Please don't leave out any SCADA equipment in this inventory either. Smart generators and HVAC systems are another common attack vector. If it squirts out network packets or can be controlled remotely, it should be on your list. Segmenting your network is also really important. What if we took our example from earlier and segmented out each area and vendor in the hospital? Now each area is contained. In case the DERP in admissions wants to infect their computer, that mess will be contained to that segment. While admissions will kind of have a crappy day, it avoids a catastrophe where to spread to the entire hospital. Each operating room is also its own little island, and it's isolated from the rest of the hospital. And if you have a vendor that can't or won't patch their equipment and it gets infected by a user getting around their weak user controls, the spread is contained to that segment, so you can call the vendor and make them deal with their shitty product. Egress filtering. External exposure of the network is equally important. Don't allow inbound ports unless you absolutely need them. A doctor or a vendor demands access to specific equipment? Cool. Make it accessible internally and require them to VPN. Actually monitor the logs. Make sure the logs are logging and log in once in a while to look at the logs. There's plenty of reliable software to help with this as well. It can be kind of daunting. Some vendor equipment doesn't write to the Windows event log, and they keep their own text log files. Make sure you get the vendor to give you access to these logs. If you set up egress filtering, look at the logs to see what's trying to get out. This is an immensely valuable resource. Validate your backups. Don't keep them in the authenticated centralized storage. Make sure your backups are actually being backed up and validate that the data is good. You'd be surprised how much heavy drinking could be avoided by just validating backups. Put an incident response plan in place for different scenarios. I've seen an incident response plan that simply says, call Steve. This is not a good incident response plan. And even though it's a bad incident response plan, it's better than no plan. There should at least be a data loss plan, a virus outbreak plan, and a ransomware plan, which is basically a combination of the first two. Just like you triage patients, do the same thing with your incident response plan. Identify your highest priorities and have those addressed first with your end goal in mind. Once the plan is written, exercise it before it's actually needed so you can work out the kinks. Those are just the basic first steps, but don't stop there. This is a screenshot from the HIPAA OCR audit page. Phishing and social engineering are a thing. It's a pretty big thing too. Social engineering training for your staff will help them recognize bad emails and help them from clicking on all the things. Additionally, it will show them what to do if they do introduce a virus onto the network. Part of social engineering training is also to challenge people. If you or someone on your staff doesn't recognize them, ask them who they are. This might irk a doctor or a VP, but instilling this kind of security culture within the workforce makes for a safer environment, and after a certain point, it kind of self-perpetuates. A decommissioning schedule is also critical for both the vendors and the users. This will cut down machines running end-of-life operating systems or software that is no longer receiving security updates or patches. If an extended support contract is going to be put in place, it should have provisions for updating the operating system and be backwards compatible with the current hardware. For vendors, if you start thinking about the upgrade path while developing the current version, it will save a lot of time, headache, and money. Backdoors from the factory, static passwords, weak default credentials, shared passwords, password reuse for clinic logins. Cut that shit out. Seriously. I'm sad this slide even exists. While two-factor auth is a regulation requirement for some specific forms of equipment, like medical dispensers, this should be the standard across the board. The next time your facility is looking to purchase new equipment, demand two-factor authentication. Vendors will do a lot to secure your business. Make them work for it. By the way, Mel Brooks got this pretty spot on. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 ranks in at number 3 on the worst password list according to Splash Data. So test your defenses. This is something that should be done regularly, at bare minimum once per year, but ideally every quarter. Equipment gets reimaged or brought out of storage. Staff changes, configurations change. Getting a security assessment gives you a feel for where you stand. Again, this all comes down to budget. While any kind of budget can be difficult to obtain, starting small is better than nothing. Over time, the implemented security will start paying for itself in the form of reduced costs from incidents or preventing breaches. Well, this should also hopefully help grow the budget. If you're able to secure some kind of budget, make remediation of findings part of that budget or tack that onto the maintenance budget, if at all possible. Having a good grasp on security is a highly marketable trait. Vendors, clinics, and patients don't want to be part of a breach. WannaCry has made it painfully obvious to the public that security is lacking in the medical industry. While HIPAA and high-tech compliance is a good first step, it's not enough to provide the needed security. The medical industry needs to start taking security seriously and take steps that go beyond regulatory compliance. What we covered in this topic is common knowledge to attackers which target hospitals, and that's the wrong group of people to be best informed on these topics. It's been reported that in 2006 there were 27.3 million patient records breached on average, about once per day. This is entirely not okay. If nothing else, I hope that someone listening right now that works in medical can inform their facility or vendor that Windows patching is outside the FDA software review process, and we can start securing some of these machines. There has been a lot of visibility to this issue in the last several weeks, and I really hope it instills positive change. Thank you for sharing your time with me. So I'm at about 2 minutes left. Is there any questions or? All right, we're done here then. Woo! Thank you.